And this is one such research question which we've been trying to cope with for some years, and I think we've managed to make some progress over the last year. As you can see, it is co-authored with Pierre-André and Monica Diaz from the IFS. Now, the route into this research question was a policy, kind of a basic policy question. You know, what are the long-term impacts of policy? And actually, given some of our interests as well, you know, if you want to design policy that's going to change the allocation, say, to kids and so on, you know, how should you do that if you take into account that that you change who marries whom, or that you might change who marries whom, that you might change intra-household allocations. Indeed, that's the kind of main mechanism. Now, I cannot say that we are quite there yet, and I will explain as we go along what does our current model give us and what it can't give us. But however, this is certainly looking at the long-term effects or potentially of policy, how it will change education choices, how it will change the marriage market, how these things interact. And basically we're exploiting two fundamental Beckerian insights. The first is, of course, the notion of human capital, and the second is the notion of matching as an equilibrium phenomenon. And of course, we're bringing these two together. And it's kind of I guess given the recent passing away of Becker, it's kind of nice to think of these two major insights that have been that he gave us, that's keeping us employed for many years. Okay, so the first question is, do we have positive assortative matching on human capital? And if you do any correlation in the data, you'll find positive assortative matching. And one motivation, of course, is public goods, right? And they tend to give such sorting. But on the other hand, risk sharing might take you the other way, right? Particularly because volatility of income tends to increase with education, and also there's a level effect. I mean, it depends really on the structure of preferences, but even if we were talking about proportional risk, it might matter. Okay, so and indeed household production might take you the other way as well if you've got specialization. So these are all issues that eventually are in the agenda to look at. So basically what we're doing in this paper, we're drawing together two strands of the literature. We're drawing the standard labor supply models that basically take marriage and education as exogenous. And so here we actually model family labor supply and education and marriage, and they're all endogenous together. So we bring these two together. And of course, we are building that into a collective framework. And at least in the standard collective model, the Pareto weights that drive intra-household allocations are taken as exogenous. We endogenize them. Okay, so on the one hand, you've got labor supply, marriage, and education. We endogenize education and marriage in that context. And on the other hand, we have a collective model where we're actually going to use the equilibrium in the marriage market to pin down intra-household allocations. Now, at the moment, at least, we're working with a transferable utility framework. Of course, this makes a bunch of the analysis much, easier. I wouldn't say much easier. Makes it easier and more tractable, but does have some limitations in terms of, if you like, the grand motivation of this kind of paper. So, for example, in our framework, it can never be the case that that by changing the outside option of the woman, increasing her bargaining power or whatever, you will actually change the allocations of the public goods. And if you think of the public goods as kids, then we're not there yet. On the other hand, we have an interesting framework where there are actually income effects on both labor supply and on public goods. So making the household richer will tend to put more allocations to kids. Now, the background, of course, to this are earlier dynamic papers. Of course, Mazzocco 2007, who looked at the collective model in a dynamic framework, and was one of the first to talk of a limited commitment in this context. Alessandra Voina's paper on policy and divorce, a new paper we've been working on it for some years now, with Luigi Pistaferi, Hamish Lowe, and Alessandra, again developing a limited commitment framework. Our model here is going to be a full commitment model, but then again it's going to be an equilibrium model in contrast to these papers. We are working on an extension of what we're doing with limited commitment. So. Okay, now, the other thing, of course, we endogenize is because we're talking about sorting, we're endogenizing the identity of the spouse, which is going to be endogenous in our context. And finally, we're going to the other aspect that we are kind of doing. We're endogenizing premarital human capital investments. In other words, we're going to be looking at the education decisions in advance of people going into the marriage market, but in anticipation of the possible returns in the marriage market. Now, the fact that intra-household allocations are important for understanding premarital investments, of course, we are not the first to say that. A good example is the Chiaporighi, Gun and Weiss paper in the ER. So we draw on that. We draw also on Chu and Xiao and Chiapori, Salonier, and Weiss, who developed a stochastic matching framework. This was a key part of what we're doing, which made what we're doing actually tractable. So that's a very important component to our approach. Now, in these papers here, both the size of the surplus and its distribution are identified from matching patterns. So in that context, you might ask, what are we adding here? Well, what we are adding is that we are using life cycle behavior, labor supply, and savings to identify the value, if you like, the value of the surplus. And then we're using matching patterns to back out Pareto weights. So in some sense, we're adding much more identifying information over the life cycle by using observations about transitions in and out of work effectively. Okay, so that's kind of the key insight here. So if you like, it's a Chu and Xiao. If you like, in a very simple way, it's a Chu and Xiao model. However, the value that is there to be split is identified from life cycle behavior, right? That's the key thing to see of what we're doing. So what are the key features of our model? Basically, agents, that's the outline. This is the model, right? So agents invest in education before entering the matching game, the marriage market. So they decide between high school or college in our model. Then that generates what we call human capital, which can then evolve over the life cycle stochastically. So what does human capital depend on? It depends on the educational investment, on ability, and on random shocks afterwards. So basically, when you marry your spouse has a certain level of ability, has a certain level of education. That describes their human capital. But then they're going to receive shocks, and you might be badly surprised a few years back. But we are but we don't have divorce in our model, so you're stuck with a guy. So, human capital stock determines the wage, a standard, of course, human capital type model, and shocks affecting human capital and wages are multiplicative, so that's kind of important. And then there is efficient risk sharing within the household, so conditional on the total allocation of consumption and within a particular period. Basically, there's going to be efficient labor supply and efficient risk sharing of consumption, and there are going to be preferences over leisure, one private good and one public good. And we're going to be on a transferable utility context. So there are going to be 3 stages of life. In stage 3 consists of T years, so that's your life cycle. So that's, if you like, the standard life cycle model. Then now it turns out, as we're going to show, I'll outline why, under transferable utility, despite all the uncertainty and all that, and under the structure of preference that we have, which is where flow utility is transferable, then it turns out that this is like a dynamic life cycle model, but it is unitary. Okay, so that's what makes it simple. Well, simpler. Okay, so that's going to define the total expected surplus at the household level, and at that point you cannot determine intra-household allocations effectively because of the TU structure. Then stage 2, that's when you enter the marriage market. What happens there, basically that determines who marries whom, right, in terms of human capital, and it determines also the future contingent intra-household allocations. So that's where the Pareto weights are fixed, and ultimately it kind of defines the returns to education, because the returns to education are driven by both labor market returns and who do you get to marry and how much you get to extract from that marriage. And finally, in stage 1, you get the education decisions. Now, when you make education decisions, well, we're not sure if that's written in stone, but you do not know your preference about marriage. There's going to be random preference about marriage, which I'm going to describe. You do not know them. You do not know if you like who you'd like to marry, but you do know your ability, which of course makes education endogenous, right? So at this point here, when you make your education decision, you know if you're a high or a low ability person, and of course that matters for your education choice. Yeah.
When you say you don't know your preference, you mean you don't know the idiosyncratic part?
Yes, the idiosyncratic part. No, so this model is going to have basically, you're going to see 6 types of people, which is a combinations of education and ability, three education levels and 2 abilities, and you have and you will have a random preference for them, exactly like in the Chu and Xiao context.
But there's no mean that you would like the higher one.
Oh, you know that your preference for marriage will depend on the entire life cycle value of matching with somebody, that you will know, and on how much you like to associate with that kind of person, that you don't know, so you're integrating it out. However, this is not, we're not stuck to that. There are technical advantages to making it known, but that's how it is at the moment. So human capital depends on gender, schooling, and ability. And basically the wage rate evolves over the life cycle. This is an autoregressive process, could be a random walk, but we don't force it to be. And this is the original kind of human capital, and this is age. So there is an age profile, because we don't want to be modeling the effects of experience. That will be too complicated. So age here is proxying for learning over the life cycle. Okay, so and of course that return is known. That bit is known when you marry. These updates are not known.
I don't fully understand the 3 periods. So
stages.
3 stages. So in every period, some people in stage 1, some people in stage 2.
No, I mean we just think. Well, we're not doing an overlapping generations model. So just look at one cohort of people. They make their education choices. That's stage 1. Then they enter the marriage market. That's stage 2. Then they live their lives together. Sorry?
They all do that at the same time.
Yes. Yeah. You could think of that. Yes. Yeah. We don't. I mean, obviously, this is a frictionless model. So obviously, it makes sense to define a matching period. Now, if you, of course, introduce frictions like in Luca's paper, then, of course, there may be, but in our model, everything happens at these points. Okay, so labor supply, so there are preferences over consumption and labor supply, which is discrete. You either don't work or you work. And this is the specific structure of utility. As you can see, the key point here, there are two key points, is that the marginal utility of consumption for each person, forgetting about this, is the same, and it's the public good. Q is the public good. This is basically labor, and it's multiplied by some kind of parameter. Now the important thing here is that this parameter again depends on age, gender, and schooling. So your preferences over leisure and consumption will differ depending on your education. And the reason we're putting age here is again because we want to cheat a little bit. We cannot, at the moment, we cannot model fertility and all the changes that happen over people's life cycle that drive, of course, labor supply, particularly female labor supply. So we've proxied that, if you like, approximated by an age profile in preferences to keep things a bit simpler. Now, so individuals maximize lifetime expected utility based on Pareto efficiency. So, so first of all, let's when we talk about solving the model, let's think about within period. So total household consumption and labor supply do not depend on the Pareto weight, and the way to see this is that once you've conditioned on total consumption in any particular period, right, then it's like two-stage budgeting. Then you can think of maximizing within period utility. And since in the within period utility context the cardinalization does not matter, you can undo the log. The log, of course, is important because our people are risk averse. But as far as within period allocation are concerned, you can undo the log, and then you end up with basically a linear problem here, right? And the first order conditions for consumption imply that the Pareto weight is equal to 1, which basically says that you have exposed, you have a transferable utility framework here. Okay, so that's.
No income effect on labor supply?
Actually, there is, and there is because of the interaction with the public good. So that's kind of nice. So we're a little bit away from the most simple TU framework. Now, the next bit to show, the next key analytical thing here is to show that the TU property survives the kind of intertemporal problem. And the intertemporal problem is a problem under uncertainty. Why? Because you've got these shocks to male and female wages, right? So there's uncertainty there. So what you need to show at this point is that the TU property survives that, and I'm told that there is a result by Schulhofer and Voll, which actually implies exactly what we want. Now, what does this say? This says that if this is the well, suppose this is the value of the male, and this is the value of the female, then you can represent this sum of utilities as a function y of h here, where the household actually maximizes that y of h. This is a vector, of course, of the two human capitals. So basically, this additivity property that I showed you within period carries over intertemporally as well, which is, of course, very, very useful. Now, so let's look at these elements one by one. We can think of the utility of the male of being this, if you like, the value that the male gets from marrying a female H, and let's think of this as the deterministic part of the value. I told you there's going to be a stochastic part, right? And basically this thing here, we can link it directly to the individual value functions by this transformation. Okay, and then you end up with the total economic value of the match as being the sum of these two value functions. Okay, so that defines basically the value function of a couple, right, over the life cycle. And analogously, you can define the value function of somebody remaining single. Something I didn't emphasize enough is that an option that people have is not to marry, right? And that's not going to be, because of the stochastic nature of the problem, it's not necessarily going to be the lowest quality people who don't marry. So that's the value of being single. So now, and of course, I forgot to say that this thing here is this. It's just change of notation. So the total surplus, the total deterministic surplus of marriage can be written as the sum of these value functions that I showed you before, minus, of course, the outside options of remaining single. Now, so as in CEAR and CEAO, there is each person has a random preference. Now this is a random preference for marrying a type HJ. It's not for a particular person, and it's not a match-specific effect. Now, it turns out that if you have a model with no frictions whatsoever, and you allow for match-specific effects with broad support, basically you don't get any single people, effectively because there's always going to be somebody out there that you will you will match perfectly well with, and since the model is frictionless, then of course you're not going to have any single people. So that's not on. So I view it as a cost of not having any frictions. So what you do here, you have an individual preference for a type of person. Okay, and so the total surplus of marriage, including the stochastic bit, is the deterministic bit I showed you before, plus these random components. Okay, now the total value of marrying without the outside options is, of course, the value function that's going to be identified of the labor market behavior of the life cycle, plus these random bits here. And basically, you have the usual stability condition that if these are the optimal values, then when the sum of these values here have to equal the value of marrying the right person. However, if you are mixed with the wrong person, then the sum of these values are going to be larger than what you get by putting people randomly together. Now, next result we live off is this result by Chiaporissa, Lanier, and Weiss, who prove this separability result, basically that you can write the entire, you can split up the surplus into a male and a female value, or not the surplus, total value, if you like, right? And basically you can represent the whole problem of matching as the male choosing the optimal female, or the female choosing the optimal male. So basically, for all H, let's take a man. For all H, the man is going to choose a woman of type A, of type HF, such that his value is larger than all other possible outcomes. Don't forget, at this point where matching is happening, the only thing you know about the other person is their human capital, and the only thing you care about is their human capital, which is a function of schooling and ability. So there are basically 6 types of women for men and 6 types of men for women. And the woman has exactly the same condition.
Also, when H equals 0, you're desingle.
Yes, single as well, absolutely. So this includes singles. Okay, so this gives you a multinomial discrete choice model, and the point is, though, that implicit in this value is the Pareto weight. In other words, this consists of two things: the total surplus of putting two people together and the way this surplus is being shared. And the other, of course, key point is that since you've got, it turns out that you can estimate this model with a logit, right? And you can back out the Pareto weights from there directly, but you can also repeat this from the female perspective. And since these are in equilibrium, you should get exactly the same outcomes. So there's an over-identifying restrictions test here that if I take only one side of the market, if you like, and solve the problem, that should give me the same answer as taking the other side of the market. Now, I'm going to talk more about matching afterwards because there are a couple of important points. But I'm now going to go to stage one, where education choices are made in anticipation of the marriage market. So individuals do not know their marital preferences at this point. So to be specific, that means they do not know this. Yes?
Maybe you will talk about it later, but are you going to clarify exactly how the Pareto weight?
Yes, yes, yes. That's the thing I'm going to add later. So so you don't know these betas, but you do. There are costs of education. That's of course critical, and they're going to depend on observables. That's going to help us with identification, and I'm going to tell you what kind of instruments we use, and we're going to assume that conditional on parental background, parental income at the time of education choice affects education, but not preferences. So that's going to be the instrument. So basically, from the perspective of the education point, there is a value function for each level of education, which is the max conditional on having particular level of human capital. The anticipation is what's the match going to be, all right? That's what the expectation here is taken over these unknown marital preferences. Right, and consequently, schooling is the level of schooling that gives you the highest value given the expected optimal match minus the cost of education. The cost of education is going to depend on observables, XM, and on some kind of random component. And similarly for the woman. Okay, so you anticipate, you don't know your marital preferences, you anticipate the expected value of each level of education, which now is a function of your labor market returns and your marriage market returns, and then you take the best. But of course, you take into account the costs. So, what am I? Okay, so well, this is not saying much. It's saying that you can choose consumption of each individual and public good within period conditional on savings. That's two-stage budgeting. I've said that already. But importantly, ex ante, conditional on aggregate consumption, aggregate household consumption, individual consumption is allocated. That's where the Pareto weight comes in, basically to equalize, so that the ratio of the marginal utilities equals the Pareto weight that's going to be shown in the matching. So basically, what you have here is two things. First of all, you've got the within household perfect insurance, and then you've got the allocation, which is driven by the Pareto weight. Okay, so. Fine. Okay, I don't think this is so interesting. Well, we discussed in the paper how we solve the model step by step. Okay, so data. So we use the British Household Panel Survey for the years from 1991 to 2008. We have 4,300 couples and about 1,100 about 1,000 single men and women, a bit more men. Basically we just look at marital status beyond 30. So you're married if you're married after 30, you're not married if you're not married after 30.
So you mean if you're married at some point after 30, or if you're never married?
If we at some point after 30. Singles are those who never married, and those married followed for the entire marital. I mean, these are some difficult decisions here, but and we ignore divorce, although one could introduce divorce. Yeah. So there are going to be 3 education levels: the compulsory schooling, high school, and college. We net out aggregate growth, and employment is defined as working 5 hours or more per week. The wage equation is pretty standard, just to make so this is the gender schooling intercept. This is the gender schooling experience profile, call it like that if you like. This is ability, and these are the random shocks. They follow an autoregressive process. We estimate the raw, and that's it. Now this earnings, of course, right? Because you either work or you don't work. Now, as I said, in our model, both education and marriage are endogenous, although marriage only causes composition effects. It doesn't create it doesn't create value. In other words, while education, the relation between wages and education reflects both composition of who is getting education and who is not, and also gives you a return, right? While marriage is only composition, right? There's no marital effect on wages. That's important for identification, what I just said. So the kosher way of estimating this, which we have not done, is to solve the model completely from education onwards. Then for each trial parameter set, generate moments. Then match these moments to the data. And what this means is that for each parameter set, you have to solve the full equilibrium. This is, we've just not done it yet, but we think what we've done works well. We still, of course, are going to solve the model because we need to do that for counterfactual simulations. But we believe we can avoid having to solve the model for estimation purposes, and hopefully you will agree with me. So this is our simplified procedure. We're going to estimate the earnings process, and we're going to use instruments for for education and for employment. So we're going to estimate 3 earnings equations depending on each of the education groups, right? And then we're going to use a control function approach to control for the endogeneity of education. Then and for employment. Now, given that, that's sorry to have to go back. So that's going to identify this component here, this component here, and the raw. Okay, and this in some sense has been orthogonalized out by the instrumentation procedure. Oops, sorry. Now, once we've got these parameters I just showed you, we're going to fix the parameters of the life cycle profile of earnings, and we're going to solve the post-marriage problem, conditional on marriage, and that's going to give us the parameters characterizing labor supply and the distribution of ability conditional on education and marriage. In other words, but of course from that, now that's where the assumption that marriage doesn't cause any benefits other than composition comes in, because now we know, of course, the distribution of education and ability, and we can construct everything we want. So then the next step is to back out the Pareto ways. I will show how, and then we estimate the parameters driving education. In my view, once you buy this, all the rest is correct. So it depends. So because really what's being estimated out of the model are these earnings profiles. And once you're happy that we've identified the returns to education correctly, then the whole of the procedure is consistent. This is not terribly innovative. It's the various earnings profiles for men and women by education group. I mean, by the way, I just want to emphasize the huge advantage of doing the estimation the way we're doing it is it takes us a few days rather than a few years. Okay, so the correlation coefficient turns out to be quite high for women, not that high for men. There's an important variance in the innovations, right? You can, it's kind of it's more or less the same actually across education groups. I'm not sure why this is coming out so low. For men, actually, for women, the higher education group is subject to lower variance shocks, while the lower ones to higher variance shocks. That's okay. Now this is so here. What you have is start seeing a kind of sorting in the data. So these are ability, and these are ability cells. These are education levels for men and for women. So, for example, what's this telling you here? Let's go to the highest ability, to the highest education group. We can see that most high educated people, are high ability married here, right? While you've got some low ability within education group, right? And okay, so here again, if you look at high school men vis-a-vis high school women, you've got high ability is the biggest proportion, and then you've got this group is the next biggest proportion. So this, if you like, is the joint distribution of ability, education, and schooling that we're going to use. Yes.
Why do you think you're getting so low persistence for the men?
I'm not sure.
Do with any ability?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't have to do with that because earlier other stuff that I've been involved in, we always take into account of ability, or some kind of, if you like, underlying fixed effect.
But it is pretty low.
It is low, and I'm not sure why. I don't have a good answer, but something that we should be looking at. This is I think really interesting. Basically, single men tend to be lower ability, while single women tend to be higher ability. So if you see a single woman, she's more likely to be drawn from the high part of the ability distribution. If you see a single man, he's more likely to be drawn from the lower ability distribution. Okay, particularly among the slightly lower education levels. Here it's 50% of single men are low ability, while among single women, that's the opposite. That's why I hesitated. High ability. So 90% of single women are high ability. Okay. So we've got this distribution. So now we're going to match profiles of employment to get these parameters here. I mean, it's all done. We have to take into account of random preferences and so on, which we do. So we estimate these profiles, and we're done. So I've not forgotten the matching patterns. They are coming. This is first of all the total economic surplus from marriage. There's already something quite interesting here, so as you go here, as you go down here, so you're fixing the human. So there are 6 levels of human capital, right? two ability levels, 3 education, right? So these are low ability, low education, right? You can see that the surplus, the structure of the surplus as the human capital of the male increases is not that enormous. Now, if you take a low ability, take this line here, the gradient is much steeper. So going up the human capital distribution of women is much more valuable for the surplus, right? So look here. So here we have a 2-2. So it's education level 2, high ability woman. She's married to a low life here, but then actually going up the human capital distribution is not a massive improvement for the while if you go in that direction, right? Getting a higher human capital woman is very valuable. Okay, and that's the reason for that is because education matters much more for employment outcomes for women than it does for men. I'm not saying it doesn't matter for men, but it matters much more for women. So these are the employment rates for different education levels of men. These are the employment rates for different education levels of women. Okay, so there's a much bigger labor market return also for wages. You see, these are the wage returns for women in education, and these are for men. So that's why. Okay, so a high education woman is very, very different from a lower educated woman, while a high educated man is I thought you were a co-author, not a
You come to I don't know who you are.
Okay, so now the way thing works here. So these are the matching. These are what we observe. Now these are this is basically the probability that this guy marries person H, right? It's the probability that this value here is higher than all other values. Now, so you can collect the error terms together and you get the deterministic values. Now, in the paper, we show that the value that the male gets, this V function, which is a transformation of the original basically life cycle utility, is equal to a deterministic bit plus a function of the Pareto weight. So impose an extreme value distribution on the betas. That's a logistic, and you can basically invert and this this bit you've identified from the rest of the life cycle, so you can then solve directly for that. Now immediately you will ask me, does identification depend on the logistic assumption? And the answer is yes and no. It is yes here because we don't have any exogenous variables that shift marriage rates. If you have data where you can look over a bunch of different marriage markets which have different exogenous variables shifting the value of marriage, then actually you can do away with this distributional assumption, which might be objectionable. But with just one market, no, you can't. Okay, but it's not, if you like, a fundamental problem with the approach. The model is identifiable. As usual, you need better data, but it's not crazily better data. It's data about you need, of course, an assumption that the preferences are the same across these marriage markets, and only the things that shift the value, if you like, the cost of marriage, perhaps the number of nightclubs in the region that if they shift, you want to be more single, things like that. Okay, so this probability here is exactly what I was showing you in the table before. Right? It's drawn from the joint distribution of ability and schooling. between males and females. So that's what we've estimated. So we have this. So we can go back here and we can invert and get the Pareto weights. So I think it's quite nice, for the little shortcut of estimating the earnings equations on their own, we've got tons of value out of that. So, and this is how it looks like. The Pareto weight of the male has been normalized to 1, so this is the ratio of the female to the male. So you can let's look at an extreme, a low ability, low schooling female married to a high ability astrophysicist, doesn't get much out of life. She gets a Pareto weight of 0.05, right? But if she is, it's actually, when they are both equal, nobody marries above their station, then get a Pareto weight of 1, right? And and then you get all the other combinations. So these kind of make some sense.
What about the top left? Why is it's driving that to be 0.19? The low type moment, the low type man match so far below.
I guess it has to do with the structure of the marriage market, how many women there are, how many men there are. I have not. Sorry?
What about earnings?
Earnings, yes. Labor market opportunities are better. What do you say, Marianne?
I know that in Kate Corey's paper, there are more women who get college degrees, and so that means that the women, so there's like some of the women have to compare with the lower educated women, and so they have to take the reservation.
Yeah, so it might have to do with relative supplies. It has to do with the labor market returns.
It's what the data tell you. I mean, this comes directly from how many women of any given type marry how many men of any given type.
Comes up.
There is a one-to-one relation.
Basically comes off this joint distribution here. Now, then the next exciting thing is to look at sorting. And this, forget about the table. The point is that the surplus is actually supermodular, right? And nothing was forced on that, right? And so if the surplus is supermodular, then you want to ask, well, do we have positive assortative matching? Now, of course, here, this is a stochastic matching model. So, what kind of sorting you're going to have is going to be a trade-off between the complementarity of putting a male and a female together with the importance of the stochastic bit. Now you can look at supermodularity. Sorry, let's go back here by taking any submatrix, kind of sum the diagonals minus the off diagonals. If that's a positive number, then that's supermodular. If you inspect that, you'll basically see that it is supermodular. It's not, it's not. You don't get everything on the diagonal. You do get off diagonals. That's what stochastic matching gives you. Thank God for that, because that's what you get in the data, right? So stochastic matching here is extremely important, but yet there is this feature of positive assortative matching. So then you might ask, of supermodularity. Then you might ask, do you have PAM? And basically, if effectively you forget about this slide, the important thing is to look at these probabilities in this horrible table and ask yourself if you tend to get more people on the diagonal and less people off the diagonal, over and above, if you like, what you'd get from pure random matching. And the answer is, we have not tested the significance of that, but the answer is that in the majority of cases, you get positive assortative matching. And that's, and it's kind of interesting that this is predicted from the structure of the surplus, right? It's not, it's not in any way imposed. So there you are. That's now. Finally, we this is only interesting for the sequel of the paper that doesn't exist yet, where there'll be counterfactual simulations. But we don't forget, in what we've done up to now, we've recognized the endogeneity of education, right? So that's all built into the estimates. But if you want to close the model and you want to be able to say, okay, what's happening if I'm going to give scholarships to young women, right? What's going to happen? Or what's going to happen if I introduce, I don't know, a program supporting women, unemployed women later in life? Then, if you want to exploit the whole structure of the model, you have to solve the equilibrium, and that involves changing the education decisions, as Luca also told us in his presentation. So what we do here, in order to get some traction, so don't forget we already have the values, right? And we know the values conditional on ability, so that's all known at this point. So basically now we're going to do again, in this case, a multinomial logit, but we don't have to. And we're going to, for cost of education, we're going to do the following. We're going to introduce we're going to take all the family background variables of the BHPS. We're going to do a factor analysis. We're going to take two principal components that are going to summarize your family background, whether you come from let's say high education, low education, whatever background, and these are these factors here. And then we're also going to introduce parental income. Now the idea is that parental income given background is like a liquidity shock. So we think of this as permanent income, right? And we think of this condition of that as the liquidity shock. This is what when we did the earnings function, we used parental income, the residual, after regressing it on these factors. So the instrument in the earnings equation for education was the residual of a regression of income on background. In other words, take out the permanent stuff, leave the liquidity shock, that's the instrument. So in this education choice equation, of course, we have to put these back. It's a discrete choice model. So, and basically, you get very, very sensible things. You get the liquidity shock affects very strongly. So, of course, one element there is the value, but it doesn't have a parameter on it. It affects, the liquidity shock affects both high school attendance and university attendance for both, well, actually for, interesting, for men, not for women, right? But for university women. That reflects the fact that more women go to high school anyway. And of course, background goes the way you'd expect it, particularly this, so it's a different factors matter for different education levels. Anyway, that's the bare bones of our, well, it's our education choice model. So now the next step is, which we've not quite done, is to solve the model, to be able to reproduce different equilibria and then do interventions, interesting interventions at different parts of the life cycle to see how they feed both into the labor market and in incentives to work and so on, but how they change who marries whom and the education choices. Okay, so that's all.
Questions?
Sorry, just a quick question. When you say that the gradient for male education is higher, but you mean on the effect on the overall surplus or on her share of the?
No, the overall surplus.
Okay, but then if it is higher, then would it mean that assuming a quadratic surplus is not good? The functional form, which is a very popular one, used
I haven't.
functional form quadratic.
Well,
so it means that it's not symmetric.
Yeah, but this is discrete by level of education. It's not continuous. So
No. But since it's
not
talking
symmetric.
gradient, gradient usually means the first
yeah.
derivative.
It seems not to be symmetric, and it's true that in most applied theory paper, we tend to assume symmetric circles.
Yeah, exactly.
But assuming symmetric function is part of political correctness. So, the data can allow not to be politically correct.
Yeah, but then it's
But not in the usual way that people are politically incorrect, right?
Isn't just a comment in both papers? I mean, mean, there is this endogenous matching equilibrium, and then you want to do, but the labor market doesn't seem to respond. I mean, the labor market earnings function, you do a counterfactual, and people go to school more, but the earnings function remains the same. So it's a kind of weird,
You're telling me that we're not you're saying we're not solving for equilibrium in the labor market.
Yeah, but the experiments you're conceptualizing are very large-scale experiments, right?
Well, I don't, wait, yes, sure, I understood the comment. So I don't think it's very, if you're willing to allow a simple production economy, right, without adjustment costs and dynamics and all, it's very easy to do, I mean, I've done it in another paper. It's not that difficult. In other words, all you need to put is another stage there where you feed in more high school graduates, whatever. You have to decide if men and women are perfectly substitutable or not, and then you get out a new price, and you can iterate on that. So you could do that, yes.
Channeling Jeremy. Jeremy's keeping quiet.
Thank you.